Emily Reed was a 32-year-old woman who appeared to have it all: a loving husband, a comfortable home in the suburbs of Boston, and a life that many envied. Born and raised in a small town in Massachusetts, Emily had always been the quintessential good girl, straight A student, prom queen, and later, a dedicated wife. She married her college sweetheart, David Reed, a successful real estate developer who had built a small empire from the ground up. They had met during their sophomore year at Harvard, where Emily studied English literature and David pursued a degree in business. Their relationship had seemed perfect from the start, two ambitious young people with the world at their feet. David, now 35, was the epitome of the self-made man. He came from a modest background, growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Boston. His parents had instilled in him a relentless work ethic, and he had used it to climb the ranks of the real estate industry. He was handsome, charismatic, and had a sharp mind that he used to his advantage in both business and personal matters. To everyone who knew them, David and Emily were the perfect couple, living the American dream in their beautifully restored Victorian home. Then there was Mark Turner, David's best friend since childhood. Mark was 34, a ruggedly handsome man with an easygoing charm that made him popular with everyone he met. He had a less prestigious career than David, working as a construction manager for one of David's companies, but he was content with his life. Mark had never married, and his relationships tended to be short-lived, partly because he could never shake the feeling that he was living in David's shadow. Despite their different paths in life, David and Mark had remained close, their friendship a constant through the years. The story began on a warm summer evening in early June. Emily and Mark had been meeting in secret for months, a relationship born out of boredom, restlessness, and a deep-seated desire for something more thrilling than the routine of suburban life. Their affair was dangerous and exhilarating, the kind of thing Emily had only read about in the novels she devoured in college. It was as if she had stepped into one of those stories, where passion and danger lurked around every corner. That evening, Emily found herself in a dimly lit hotel room on the outskirts of Boston. The room was nondescript, just like the dozens of others they had met in over the past few months. Anonymity was their only safeguard. The bed was unmade, the air heavy with the scent of cheap perfume and sweat. Mark was lying beside her, his arm draped lazily over her waist, as they both caught their breath after another round of frantic, forbidden passion. Emily stared at the ceiling, a mix of guilt and excitement swirling in her mind. She knew what they were doing was wrong, but that only added to the thrill. It was as if every time they met, she was tempting fate, daring the universe to catch them. She turned her head to look at Mark, who was already reaching for his phone, his expression one of complete satisfaction. Mark wasn't the type to dwell on consequences. He lived in the moment, and right now, the moment was all about Emily. Emily, however, couldn't shake the nagging guilt that had been gnawing at her since the affair began. She loved David, at least she thought she did, but there was something missing in their marriage, something she couldn't quite put into words. David was always so focused on his work, so driven to succeed, that Emily often felt like she was playing second fiddle to his ambition. It wasn't that he didn't love her, it was just that his love was often overshadowed by his relentless pursuit of success. In Mark, Emily found the attention and excitement that had been missing in her life for so long. As she lay there, Emily's phone buzzed on the nightstand, snapping her out of her thoughts. She picked it up and saw a text from David. "How's your evening going, sweetheart?" Emily's heart skipped a beat. She glanced at Mark, who was now scrolling through his own phone, oblivious to the turmoil brewing inside her. With a shaky hand, she typed out a response, trying to keep her cool. "It's good, just relaxing. What about you?" David's reply came almost immediately. "Busy day at the office, but I've got some exciting news. I can't wait to tell you when I get home." Emily's curiosity was piqued, but before she could respond, Mark's voice cut through her thoughts. "Come on, Em, put the phone down. We got the room for another hour, let's not waste it." Emily hesitated, her thumb hovering over the send button. Part of her wanted to know what David's news was, but the other part, the reckless, impulsive part, was more interested in losing herself in the moment with Mark. She put the phone down and turned to him, pushing her doubts to the back of her mind. An hour later, as Mark was in the shower, Emily picked up her phone again. David hadn't sent any more messages, and she felt a pang of guilt for ignoring him. On impulse, she typed out a message, her fingers flying over the keys before she could think better of it. "Congrats, you're gonna be a daddy. It was a lie, of course. A cruel, thoughtless lie meant to provoke a reaction, to feel a rush of something, anything that made her feel alive. She didn't expect David's response to come so quickly, nor did she expect it to be so chilling. "Isn't he a good daddy for your kids?" The words were like a slap in the face, knocking the breath out of her. Emily's hand trembled as she read the message again, trying to make sense of it. David knew. He knew everything. A wave of nausea washed over her, and she stumbled to the bathroom, where Mark was still showering, oblivious to the storm brewing outside that small, steamy room. Emily leaned against the sink, her mind racing. How long had David known? How much did he know? And what was he planning to do about it? "Mark," she called, her voice shaky, "we need to talk." Mark stepped out of the shower, a towel wrapped around his waist, his expression shifting from carefree to concerned when he saw the look on Emily's face. "What's wrong?" "David, he knows," she whispered, holding up her phone so Mark could see the message. Mark's face drained of color. "What do you mean he knows? How could he?" "I don't know," Emily interrupted, her voice rising in panic. "But he does. He knows about us, Mark. He's been playing us this whole time." Mark swore under his breath, running a hand through his damp hair. Okay, calm down. We need to figure out what to do next. Maybe we can talk to him, explain." "Explain what?" "That we've been sneaking around behind his back for months." "He'll never forgive us, Mark." As they dressed hurriedly, the gravity of their situation became painfully clear. David wasn't the type to react impulsively. He was methodical, calculating. If he knew about the affair, he would have already set a plan in motion. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as they left the hotel, the once thrilling escape now a prison of fear and uncertainty. The drive back to Emily's house was tense and silent. Mark was behind the wheel, his jaw clenched as he navigated through the city streets. Emily sat beside him, staring out the window, her mind racing with 1,000 possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. What had David done? Had he gone to the police? Had he told their friends, their families? The possibilities were endless, and each one seemed worse than the last. When they finally pulled up to the house, Emily felt a sense of dread wash over her. The house was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. David's car was in the driveway, but there was no sign of him. Emily's hands shook as she fumbled with her keys, finally managing to unlock the front door. She stepped inside, half expecting to find David waiting for her, ready to confront her with all the damning evidence of her betrayal. But the house was silent, eerily so. "David?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she moved through the house, turning on lights as she went. The living room was empty, as was the kitchen. Everything was exactly as it had been when she left earlier that evening, except for one crucial detail. David was gone. Emily rushed upstairs, with Mark following close behind. She threw open the door to their bedroom and froze. David's side of the bed was neatly made, his clothes still hanging in the closet, his shoes lined up in perfect order. But he was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had simply vanished, leaving everything behind. "Where is he?" Mark asked, his voice low and tense. "I don't know," Emily replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She felt a cold dread settle in her stomach as she realized that whatever David was planning, it had already begun. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and fear. David didn't return, and he didn't contact Emily. She tried calling his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. She even went to his office, but his colleagues hadn't seen or heard from him either. Emily's panic grew with each passing day, the silence from David more terrifying than any confrontation could have been. Then, a month later, the police called. They had found David's car abandoned in a remote forest just outside the city. Emily's heart sank as she drove to the location, Mark by her side. The scene that awaited them was something out of a nightmare. The car was empty, the driver's side door left wide open as if David had just stepped out and walked into the woods, never to return. The police searched the area, but there was no sign of David. No footprints, no clues, nothing to indicate where he might have gone. Emily stood there, staring at the car, her mind reeling. It was as if David had disappeared off the face of the earth, leaving behind only questions and a deep, gnawing fear that she was about to pay for her sins in ways she could never have imagined. As the days turned into weeks, Emily's life began to unravel. The police launched an investigation into David's disappearance, and Emily found herself under suspicion. Every aspect of her life was scrutinized, her every move questioned. The guilt and fear that had once been a thrilling part of her affair with Mark had now turned into a waking nightmare. And in the back of her mind, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this was all part of David's plan. He had known about the affair, and he had orchestrated his own disappearance to make sure that Emily and Mark would pay for their betrayal. The thought haunted her, keeping her awake at night as she waited for the other shoe to drop. But as the investigation dragged on, Emily began to realize that David's revenge was far more sinister than she could have ever imagined. He had set a trap, and she and Mark had walked right into it. Now, there was no way out, and Emily knew that her life would never be the same again. The weeks following David's disappearance were a blur for Emily. She found herself ensnared in a labyrinth of suspicion and fear as the investigation into David's whereabouts took on a life of its own. The police were thorough, leaving no stone unturned, and soon Emily was at the center of their scrutiny. The small community where they lived buzzed with gossip, and Emily could feel the judgmental stares of neighbors who had once been friends. Mark, too, was feeling the heat. What had started as a reckless affair had now become a noose tightening around their necks. The guilt weighed heavily on both of them, but it was the fear of the unknown that truly gnawed at their sanity. David's absence was like a shadow, haunting their every move, and the longer he remained missing, the more convinced Emily became that he was orchestrating something far more sinister than they could imagine. One evening, as Emily was sorting through David's things in a desperate attempt to find clues, she stumbled upon something that made her blood run cold. Hidden at the back of David's closet, behind a row of his neatly pressed suits, was a small, locked chest. The key was taped underneath the shelf, as if David had meant for her to find it. Her hands shook as she unlocked the chest and opened it, revealing a collection of notebooks and loose papers. The journals were meticulously kept, each page filled with David's precise handwriting. As Emily began to read, her horror grew with every word. These weren't just ordinary journals. They were detailed records of David's observations and suspicions about her and Mark. David had known about the affair almost from the beginning, and he had been documenting everything. There were photos of her and Mark together, printouts of text messages, and even recordings of their conversations. Emily felt sick to her stomach. David hadn't just discovered their affair, he had been using it to manipulate them, to set them up for something terrible. The final pages of the most recent journal revealed David's true intentions. He had planned his own disappearance, orchestrating it in such a way that all evidence would point to Emily and Mark. David's plan was brilliant in its cruelty. He had set the stage for their downfall, leaving behind just enough evidence to make them look guilty of foul play. As Emily continued to sift through the chest, she found something even more disturbing. A series of letters addressed to the police, detailing a supposed plot between Emily and Mark to murder David for his life insurance money. The letters were post-dated, ready to be sent at just the right moment to ensure that Emily and Mark would be arrested. David had thought of everything. Mark arrived at Emily's house later that evening to find her sitting on the floor of the bedroom, surrounded by the damning evidence David had left behind. She looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes, clutching one of the letters in her hand. Mark, he knew? He knew all along, she whispered, her voice trembling. This was his plan. He's framing us? Mark's face paled as he took the letter from her and read it. The reality of their situation hit him like a ton of bricks. They had been played, trapped in a web of deceit spun by a man they had both underestimated. David had always been the smarter one, the more calculating one, and now they were paying the price for their betrayal. What are we going to do? Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark sat down beside her, running a hand through his hair as he tried to think. We need to go to the police. We have to tell them everything. No, Emily cried, panic rising in her chest. They'll never believe us. David's made sure of that. They already think we're involved in his disappearance. If we show them this, they'll just use it as more evidence against us. Mark knew she was right. The police were already suspicious, and this would only confirm their worst fears. But what choice did they have? They couldn't just sit back and wait for David's plan to come to fruition. They had to do something, anything, to clear their names. Over the next few days, Emily and Mark tried to come up with a plan. They considered destroying the evidence, but they knew it wouldn't solve their problem. David had undoubtedly left other traps in place, and any attempt to cover their tracks would only make them look guiltier. They thought about fleeing, but where would they go? They were both too well known in the community to simply disappear, and running would only make them look like criminals on the run. The pressure was unbearable, and it wasn't long before cracks began to form in their relationship. The once exciting affair had turned into a nightmare, and the stress of the situation brought out the worst in both of them. They began to argue, blaming each other for the mess they were in. Emily accused Mark of not taking the situation seriously enough, while Mark resented Emily for dragging him into this in the first place. In the end, it was the police who made the next move. They arrived at Emily's house one morning with a search warrant, and by the end of the day, they had found the journals, the letters, and all the other evidence David had left behind. Emily and Mark were both arrested on suspicion of conspiracy to commit murder, and their worst fears were realized. David's plan had worked perfectly. The trial was a media circus, with reporters swarming the courthouse and broadcasting every detail of the case. Emily and Mark were portrayed as cold-blooded conspirators, driven by greed and lust to commit the ultimate betrayal. The prosecution had a field day with the evidence, painting a picture of two people who had plotted to kill David in order to start a new life together. Emily sat in the courtroom every day, her heart sinking lower and lower as the prosecution presented their case. They brought out the letters, the journals, the recordings, everything that David had meticulously prepared to ensure their conviction. It was clear that the jury was convinced of their guilt, and Emily knew that their chances of acquittal were slim to none. Mark was no better off. His lawyer tried to argue that they had been set up, that David was still alive and had orchestrated the whole thing, but without any concrete evidence. The argument fell flat. The jury saw Mark as a willing participant in the plot, and his fate was sealed alongside Emily's. As the trial dragged on, Emily's mind began to spiral into despair. She thought about David constantly, wondering where he was, what he was doing, and whether he was watching the trial unfold. She imagined him somewhere far away, laughing at how perfectly his plan had worked. The man she had once loved had turned into a monster, and she couldn't escape the feeling that she had brought this on herself. The day of the verdict arrived, and the courtroom was packed with spectators. Emily sat beside Mark, her hands trembling as she awaited the jury's decision. When the foreman stood to deliver the verdict, Emily felt like she was going to be sick. "Guilty," the foreman said, his voice ringing out in the silent courtroom. On all counts. Emily's world shattered in that moment. She felt like she was floating outside of her body, watching the scene unfold as if it were happening to someone else. Mark slumped in his seat beside her, his face ashen. The judge pronounced their sentences, 15 years in prison for each of them with no possibility of parole. As Emily was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in a mirror on the wall. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Gone was the vibrant, confident woman she had once been. In her place was a broken shell of a person, hollowed out by guilt, fear, and betrayal. The first few months in prison were a blur of monotony and despair. Emily struggled to adapt to the harsh realities of life behind bars, the cold, unfeeling walls of the prison a stark contrast to the life she had once known. The other inmates eyed her warily, sensing her vulnerability, and it wasn't long before she was targeted. Emily learned quickly that prison was a place where the weak were preyed upon, and she had to toughen up if she was going to survive. Mark, too, faced his own struggles. He had always been the stronger of the two, but prison life wore him down as well. The guilt of what they had done, and what had happened as a result, weighed heavily on him, and he found himself haunted by thoughts of David. Mark kept to himself, avoiding trouble as best he could, but the loneliness and isolation were crushing. The relationship between him and Emily deteriorated further as the days turned into months. They were allowed limited contact, but when they did see each other, it was clear that the love and excitement they had once shared were long gone. The betrayal, the guilt, and the weight of their sentences had poisoned whatever connection they had. But as the years passed, something unexpected happened. New evidence came to light. A former associate of David's, a man named Carl, came forward with information that cast doubt on the original case. Carl had been part of David's real estate business, and he had always harbored resentment toward David for his ruthless business practices. He revealed that David had been blackmailing and manipulating people behind the scenes, using his knowledge of their secrets to control them. According to Carl, David had confided in him about his plan to frame Emily and Mark, bragging about how foolproof it was. Carl hadn't come forward sooner out of fear of retaliation, but with David gone, he finally felt safe enough to tell the truth. The revelation shook the foundations of the case. Carl's testimony, combined with some newly uncovered financial records, suggested that David had indeed been planning to disappear, possibly to escape some shady dealings of his own. The court granted a new trial for Emily and Mark, and this time, with Carl's testimony and the new evidence, the outcome was different. After a lengthy appeal process, their sentences were overturned. The court acknowledged that there had been enough reasonable doubt to question their guilt, and Emily and Mark were finally released from prison after serving several years of their 15-year sentences. But freedom didn't bring the peace they had hoped for. The years in prison had left deep scars on both of them, and they were different people now, hardened, disillusioned, and haunted by what they had been through. Emily returned to a world she barely recognized, and Mark found it difficult to reintegrate into society. The affair that had once brought them together was a distant memory, buried under layers of pain and regret. In the end, they went their separate ways, each trying to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of the nightmare David had created. Emily moved to a small town far away from the life she once knew, seeking anonymity and a chance to start over. Mark did the same, but neither of them ever truly escaped the shadow of what had happened. As for David, he was never found. Some believed he had faked his death and was living under a new identity, while others thought he had met with foul play. But for Emily and Mark, the question of where David was, or if he was even still alive, was one they could never answer. He remained a ghost in their lives, a reminder of how one man's twisted desire for revenge had destroyed them both.